Well, afternoon, Mark. How are you?
I'm fine, and you look a bit haggard because you've been obviously cutting down grass and hedges, I hear.
Yeah, I'm a little bit haggard. I'm haggard at the best of times, but I'm a little bit more haggard today. I've had quite a hectic morning cutting grass, which is probably meadow length for my son, who I shall discuss this with when he comes back from his lovely holiday and how he needs to keep it a little bit shorter. Bless his little cotton socks.
I joke, of course. You look wonderful, Steve.
Thank you so much. You're very kind.
What are we talking about?
How about thinking a little bit more about the Royal Navy, and the time we're certainly on the first ship that we were serving on together, which was HMS Charybdis. So let's have a little chat about some of the things that happened that you can recall or that you can share, because there'll be lots of things that would not be wise to share, about time on the Charybdis, HMS Charybdis, that beautiful Leander class frigate that is no more.
Yes, now sadly. Well, it's 40 odd years ago.
What are you saying? What are you saying? What are you trying to say?
Well, the ship only lasts about 25, 30 years. Anyway, Cherry B, as we used to call her. Interesting for myself because it was my second ship and it was my second Leander. So if I was to compare my time on HMS Aurora and HMS Charybdis, chalk and cheese. The Aurora, I was the skin of the mess. I was still learning to exist in my own skin alone in a warship. But by the time I came to Charybdis, I was 20, 1984. I was wiser. No, I'll say that again. I was older, not necessarily wiser. And overall, I was more confident and knew in advance what to expect. And of course, you was there. I worked with some really great people on the Aurora. One I especially keep in contact with now, Dell. But overall, Charybdis was the best messmates of any ship that I served on. And I'm not just saying that because it's you as well, Steve. It was true. So I have some very fond memories. But of course, you may say differently.
No, I think overall, I would say that the Cherry B was a fantastic ship to serve on. The ship's company, certainly during the time that we were on, were overall real good guys. Comms branch, the signals side of it that we worked in, really, really, really good people, very good men. And I say very good men because this was back in the day when only men went to sea. There were no women on board. There was the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens, and they supported us from shore establishments. So there were no ladies on board, and the fellows were good blokes overall. Very different initial setting for me when I came onto the Cherry B than you, because obviously, as you've said, that was your second ship. She was my first ship, and I was still 16 when I joined her. And man, that was an absolute culture shock coming on board. When I was talking to you about this and our time served, as you know, I have a little record of all of the years for goodness knows how long.
Every day.
And I just looked at the first month of joining her, because I joined her in April, and then on the Sunday and on the Monday we deployed on our Miller patrol down the Gulf, Persian Gulf, for 4.5, 5 months. And within the first 12 days of being on board, I had been threatened by the chefs to be thrown into a sink because I didn't smile enough. I had been gone ashore in Gibraltar when the lads in the mess told me that I was too gobby, that I spoke too much. Hard to believe, I know. I was told by the officers under training when I was putting them through Morse, because they had to learn basic Morse, by one of the officers, that if I could do, i.e. me, if I could do Morse code, then he certainly could, because I was a pleb. And I was adrift to come on watch, and so I was nearly trooped. And then I cocked up all of the colour party. And so within the space of 12 days being thrown into this warship, and bearing in mind we're heading down to the Gulf via Portland for the workup and the Thursday War and all the rest of it, I was just so far out of my happy place, it was not funny. But I was very excited on the Sunday, the 8th of April, that I joined the ship, and I sort of made little notes in my diary to say, oh, this is really exciting, and I really like the ship. And then it goes downhill quite rapidly from the 8th of April till the 30th of April, within that sort of time span. So within 22 days, I've covered that whole gamut of emotion. So when you joined, obviously I was a bit of an old salt then, because I had gone through all of this. I had deployed to the Middle East. I had survived a first overseas run in jib and a return run in jib, and a bit older and wiser, but not really older and wiser, just probably better able to handle myself. And that made a big difference. So it was a bit of a shock to the system. One of the things I can still remember, clear as anything to this day, is Taff Pepper, Nick Pepper, who I'm actually connected to on Facebook, and meeting me on the flight deck when I arrived on that 8th of April. So I won't forget him. He helped me get all my kit down to the mess. So good lad. Thank you, Taff. Thank you, Nick. You were a good chap. Interesting initial opening experience, and as I say, lots of ups and downs over that first deployment. Really hard work.
Yeah, they are, because you're prey to a couple of things. Your own messmates ribbing you, and of course you may not be used to it. You may be quite sensitive, you're only 16. You learn to have a hard skin by the time you come back. You're also in a confined place where half the time you don't know where you are. You have no control as to where you're going. We both served on the bridge.
Yeah.
And of course, you can get easy access to the navigation table. I loved maps. I loved cartography. Had a keen interest in the world and where we were. So I always knew where we were. But there'd be guys on board that wouldn't have a clue.
No, that's right.
Where we were, or even where things are that we'd visited. You have a little map given to you often. It's a very strange, hard to explain for anybody who's never done it. You're in a ship of about, 220 men?
I think she was around about 180 or something, wasn't she, the Charybdis?
And often you can feel the loneliest that you've ever or ever will feel if you're missing home, if you've had a run-in with someone, if you're not feeling well. It's a bizarre place to live when you really think about it. And of course, we're at the back end of the ship. Luckily, not at the front. So we're not rolling around as much, but it's all I always remember my wife saying every time she went and visited the mess when we were in port, back home, how could you sleep with all that noise? How could you, all people moving around? I remember going on leave in the early days of the Aurora, and it was odd being in a room back home where there was no noise. It's a totally unique environment, and it helps if you meet someone you can get on with.
Oh, absolutely.
If only that happened on the Charybdis.
Only it did. Who are you?
Yeah, who are you?
No, you're right, mate. And your point about the maps as well is absolutely spot on, because if you are, say, a stoker, you'd hardly ever come up for air. You're a marine engineer, you'd be working down in the bows of the ship all the time. You might come up onto the back end of the ship or onto the front end of the ship or onto one of the wastes when they used to have those things, and you might sort of have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea out there. But we were really fortunate where we worked because we had that access to the fresh air all the time and access to those maps. I noted that within sort of the first week of sailing, so we sailed on the 9th of April, and on the 15th of April, we were off Spain and Portugal. And I got all of that, obviously, information because that's where I was looking at the navigator's map. I also noted that we were being shadowed by 3 Russian warships. And and we'd got the Seawolf loaded up in case we came under attack and that sort of thing. It was all very exciting for a 16-year-old who was suddenly thrust into the Cold War scenario, because, again, that was the day when the Soviets would shadow us, and they would certainly be keeping a very close eye on what we were up to, and we would be keeping a very close eye on what they were up to. It made you grow up, mate. It really made you grow up. Very good divisional officer. I was very, very pleased to have the man who's the divisional officer. I shall name him. Sub-Lieutenant John Murphy. Exceptionally good man. He was an upper yardman, so he'd come through the ranks, and so he knew what it was like to be a lower deck. And he was just a nice guy. He was very, very supportive, very straight. Do you remember him? Was he on board when you came on, John Murphy?
I'm not sure, but is he the one that you had a run in? He said, I'm not going to do that.
He's that one, yeah, he is that one. So I won't ask you to do something that I've not done or wouldn't do myself. Words I've never forgotten. Top man. His impact in my life was very, very significant in terms of what it sowed into my life. Don't know where he is. Who knows? Could be anywhere now. But he probably wouldn't even remember who I was. But I remember him.
I don't remember any of the officers. I remember the messmates. I would say about 80% of them. Andy Parrott, of course, Wayne Graham, and Ox, who broke his arm and had to go home early. Swilly, Taff, Pepper, and so on. Pony owes me one. He does. You say that with no women on board. I was going to put this down later. But there was a thing that no longer exists in the Navy called the SODS Opera.
Yes.
So when you're away on 6-7 month deployments and you're coming back, normally as you're just about to come out of the Red Sea, the ship would park up and the flight deck became known as the Ship's Operatic Dance Society. In other words, it's a way of blowing off steam. And often, if you've ever seen Monty Python with the men dressed up as women, that tradition was very much in the Navy. of which we have pictures of, don't we?
We do indeed, Mark. We do indeed.
We look very good in green.
There are some very interesting pictures floating around of yourself and potentially me in all sorts of different attire, which is quite it's quite worrying, actually. I mean, what's going to happen when I'm the Prime Minister, for goodness sake, and somebody then pops up with a picture of me in full drag? I mean, goodness gracious.
Listen, if Boris Johnson can do it, then so could we.
Oh, hilarious. So do they not do that now then, SODS Opera?
No, they stopped it in the 90s because things changed. When we left, women came on board, and rightly so. It's about time that they were allowed to go on board. They had their own mess, obviously, away from the men, and certain things you couldn't do ashore with certain people. And then I think they got, over time, it just ran out of steam, the SODS Opera tradition. I think they brought in something else, a review or something, and it was just never the same. And I suppose it's because time had moved on. The old Navy was going with the ships. They were literally going out of service, and the old guys who had perhaps joined up in the 1940s, 50s, they were retiring. A whole new thread of being. I sensed it on my last ship.
Yeah, likewise.
HMS Brazen. Everything had changed, and so unfortunately got rid of the SODS Operas.
We lived through some of the best of it then, my old mate, because we were there in that time where you could still have a good crack and you could still have a laugh and you could still get in lots of strife and trouble and you could still be completely politically incorrect and it would still be taken in the manner in which it was meant, which was never to offend anybody, but just to make people laugh. And it was good fun overall, I think. Really good fun. The time on the Charybdis, with the exception of that first part of the deployment when I very first joined, which was just hellish for me, trying to just find my way and to know who your allies were and who weren't, and trying to navigate that from a very young age. And just such an eye-opener, man. It was such an eye-opener. When we went into Karachi, Pakistan, and we came alongside, I was sent down onto the forecastle right front of the ship to do the jack. And as I'm walking down the forecastle, I'm looking across the side, and it's hot. You know, for people that have been out to the India or Pakistan, it's really, really hot. It's quite oppressive weather, particularly if you're not used to that type of climate. And the water was really murky and muddy as we were coming into the port. And I'm looking over the side, and there's a body of a little kid floating down the side of the ship. And I'm like, what is all this about? And I'm sir, there's a body floating down there. Yep, don't worry about it. Moving swiftly on. I had my 17th birthday out in Karachi. But man, it was just such a shock to me that there were parts of the world where a child could just be allowed to float face down in the water and nobody would be trying to rescue them. I mean, clearly dead, but it was just not the sort of thing that you'd see in the River Ouse.
We saw that on the Aurora when we went to Mumbai now. There was a body in the water as we came to the wharf. And of course, if you've ever seen Slumdog Millionaire, as it used to be, it has changed, of course, for the better in many ways. But you are right. We were exposed to places that we couldn't fathom. The heat alone, I couldn't fathom. Correct me if I'm wrong. We went to Bahrain. It was so hot that somebody on the flight deck put down some tin foil, cracked an egg, and it cooked. It's just in the direct heat and the heat coming off the flight deck. You had to be very careful. You couldn't go up barefooted and do well if that was the case. And it was just unbelievable. And of course, you're not used to coming from Leicester. You weren't used to that. And of course, you're living through that. And you're going out and you're trying to enjoy yourself. And that is a real good bonding moment, really, because you've got a bit of leave, you've been at sea for weeks, and you've got to make the best of it regardless.
Oh, absolutely. You're really thrown into it. And you're faced with just situations, like you say, that you were never culturally wired to face. I can remember when we went ashore in Karachi as well. That was my first sort of experience of seeing people with leprosy on the side of the street, beggars, young children, people who are grossly invalided, dragging themselves along, begging you for money and all of that sort of thing. And it was a really massive, massive eye-opener for me. The same was true when we went into Djibouti. I don't know what it's like now, but back in the day, it was a real rum old place. A place where the French Foreign Legion used to hang out. And so the bars were full of French Foreign Legion guys, which was interesting because I remember going to one of the bars out there and sitting down next to a white guy who was a Scouser. So here we are in the middle of Djibouti, and I'm chatting to some Scouser who had done a bunk from the UK because he was now in the French Foreign Legion and he's clearly perhaps wanted by some people back in the UK for various misdeeds. everything was such a shock to the senses. It was overwhelming. Not only were you living on this sleek grey warrior of death and casting your net far and wide in terms of your travel, but you were visiting places that were so culturally different, also geographically in terms of the way that the land looked. Everything was just so different. So as a young man, all of that exposure and then sucking all of that in, and I guess it got me to ask lots of questions about, well, why have we got it so good and these people have got it so bad? How can we benefit these people? And you soon realise that the system is pretty well screwed, and for lots of reasons, and mostly because people are just foolish once they get power. And you start to, I guess it starts to seed perhaps the way that you're going to be in the future.
I've got some interesting memories of Djibouti, because I don't know if it was on the Aurora or the Charybdis. I remember coming alongside the wharf, and there were what I can only describe as refugees. I think they were from Ethiopia. It was just as the famine was breaking. And the smell. Now, I've long worried about this smell. How do you describe it? And the only way I can describe it is the smell of famine. Bodies collapsing, lack of food. And there they were, begging. They had to be kept away by guards. And then you go into Djibouti, and of course it's politically and geographically significant because it sits at the bottom of the Red Sea just before you get into the Gulf of Aden. And the Russians then had presence on Socotra Island. So a lot of the Allies would go there and have a presence. And as you say, the Foreign Legion. And you go down these hot, dusty streets, and it was just like you'd gone into a different era. You get towards the outskirts of the town and you look out, and it is literally almost biblical in what's there and the way people are dressed. It's fascinating to see. And of course, we talked about the navigation tables. I remember a book. It was somebody had drawn the coast that you see from the sea as you're approaching places like that. And it was open. I think the navigation officer had opened it to see if in fact it was accurate. And it was about 150 years old, and it was perfectly accurate to what you were seeing. And it hadn't changed. It had not changed in any point from when it was written in the mid-19th century to when we visited. It was the same coastline, no buildings, hardly anything was there, just desert. Fascinating place.
The whole trip, that first deployment, was quite fascinating. The second deployment that I had, when obviously after you had joined and we went back out to the Gulf, didn't we, in 85, that was a much better run for me personally. Everything on the ship was better. So you get that first one out of the way, get that under your belt. You now become a bit of a salty old sea dog. You then get the new lads that join who are younger than you, and the pecking order has then changed. I guess it was probably at that point, after that first deployment, that then I started to forge friendships. And obviously when you came on board, we had a good mateship and were able to have a bit of a crack and get into all sorts of little scrapes together. But as I said before, William, I won't forget us having that piggyback up and down the officers' flats outside their cabins. And you can't even remember that, can you?
No. It was in Plymouth, wasn't it?
Yeah, we were incredibly drunk, and we were just running up and down outside their cabins, giving each other piggyback races, see how quickly we could do this sprint, and getting a little bit in trouble for it afterwards.
And also, there's some pictures that you've put up on the Facebook account. It would have been taken on the flag deck in Plymouth. I vaguely remember it, but I can't say I have a proper memory of it. At the time, we were obviously messing around. There was about 4 or 5 of us up there. We took photos of each other, posed. 30-odd years later, it suddenly, wow, telescoped all those years. I didn't even recognise myself, strangely. So there's a lot, because I don't have a diary. For some reason, I blank out far too many things. I have vague memories, but none of it is really on the ship. It's all about time ashore. I don't know if you were the same.
Yeah, well, the times ashore were good, weren't they? Because we made quite a informed decision, didn't we, to say, when you go into these places, don't just go look for the nearest bar. Actually go and do something. Go on a visit. Yeah, because the ship were pretty good with the ship's liaison, weren't they? Having trips that you could sign up for before you got in and all of that sort of thing. So when we deployed, there were some really good trips that we could do. There was great places we could stay, whether it was in the Seychelles, whether it was in Kenya, whatever it was, whether it was out in China. I mean, going into China, that was fascinating. Going up the Yangtze River in Shanghai and spending time up there. I mean, that was this is back in the day when China was still very, very closed off. And I will not forget getting on a train and going off into the middle of China somewhere on this old steam train with a hammer and sickle on the front of it, in wooden carriages with waitress service, and most incredible cup of tea I've ever had was on that train. Amazing cup of tea. So there were lots of little things like that we did as well, which I think was really good. I think that was really useful. It was very, very useful. Because again, it gives you exposure to things. It gives you exposure to different people, different cultures. It gives you a feel for how people live. And it gave you the opportunity at certain times to have a peek behind the veil, to have a look behind what's really going on there, what's really happening in this country. You'd see the touristy bits, but then you'd only have to go a few streets over and then you'd see the reality.
We represented ourselves. We were ambassadors for our country, but we did things that perhaps you wouldn't get away with ordinarily. When we went to Colombo, Sri Lanka, there's about 5 or 6 of us. I don't know if you was there, Steve. We met Arthur C. Clarke. There was a trip to go and see him. I vaguely knew who he was. I knew he'd written 2001. And this old man, I'm sure it was him. I can remember meeting this old guy, and he seemed to be the same voice and blah, blah, blah that I remember from TV. There was that. But in Colombo, we went out one night, and I know Swilly was with us, because he jumped fully dressed into the Lanka Oberoi swimming pool, then got out absolutely dripping wet and was told to leave. And it may have been that same night, a load of us, you know the old tuk-tuks?
Yeah.
The motorised tuk-tuks where you could sit 2 in the back, and it's like a little motorbike at the front. We purloined 3 of them, and we made them do a race. This was about 2 o'clock in the morning, through the streets like Ben-Hur. I'm not kidding you. We were going for it. We paid them extra money to go really quick. And one of them, it may have been the one where Pony was in, literally went round the corner and I thought it was going to go over. It was literally like that. You couldn't do that now. I doubt you'd get away with that kind of stuff.
No, you're right. You probably wouldn't. It was really good fun. One of the things with Colombo, Sri Lanka, when we were there, was I went and stayed in a hotel. And I don't know if you were there. I know Mick was. There's a couple of others that were there. And we watched the festival that was going on with the elephants coming past and all of this sort of thing. So I don't know if you were. No, I don't think you were there. I don't think you were with us. Don't know where you were. You were probably on that tuk-tuk doing Ben-Hur or something behind them. But funny things that you can remember. But we had these incredible curries. And it had 5 different curries on the plate.
A guy came on board. There was a white one with little black flecks, and it was the hottest thing I've ever had. I'm sure they was taking the piss. It was so hot, it almost scorched the plate. Stuff
like that. So opening up your taste buds to different things as well, which was great.
Opening up other things as well.
Yeah, that's right. And it certainly did that all right. And I also went out to some plantation somewhere as well while I was there, and just the huge big green leaves and the overhangs, and the driver pulls across the side of the road, gets out of the truck, goes up, chops a pineapple off the tree, and then split it and handed us this. Oh my goodness, pineapple straight off the tree. Man, that was just absolutely amazing. All these little things, and they all sort of form something in you, don't they? They leave their little mark in you. So I've got very fond memories of Colombo, Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan people that I met there were amazing. The people in Kenya were absolutely incredible people. I found that people were just people, just good folk. There were obviously always idiots that cause problems like there are everywhere. But people, humanity, is not bad.
But we did say before in another episode, it was marked, noticeable how you can go around these places and you're away from home and you're in a hot climate and you're having a laugh, and of course the people there want you to enjoy yourself because you're paying them and blah blah blah. You get back home, bam, no one's smiling. It's like chalk and cheese here. You couldn't be any different. There you go.
So overall, mate, the time on the Charybdis I thought was very good. When I left, I had the most horrendous leaving do that you could ever imagine when in Gibraltar. I've got no idea what even happened in terms of, other than being out there with Terry and drinks being lined up on the bar, and then waking up the next morning with nothing on and all my clothes outside and people having been on guard all night to make sure I didn't die. So that was it. So that was quite a way to leave the ship for sure.
Strangely, it was on the Charybdis that I handed in my notice. 18 months. Yeah. And you were going to be deployed elsewhere. I think you went to the Manchester.
I did, yes.
And that was a blow. And I began to realise I was going to go out the Gulf. I knew I was going to be deployed somewhere else. It ended up being the Brazen. Went out the Gulf again. I was missing a girlfriend. In fact, it was actually, I won't mention a name, somebody in the mess was going through a difficult time with divorce. And that had a profound effect on me because I thought, I don't want to go down that same route. And of course, I had a girlfriend, now wife, for 33 years. We've known each other 40 years this year. And I made the conscious decision I'd come out. And I handed in my notice. So I left the ship probably just after you, 86. I think it was February. So I knew that I was going to be moving on literally to another ship and then eventually the Navy. So bittersweet memories, the bit I do have. But I remember the officer, this is interesting, because this may have been the same with you. When I handed in my notice, it was very noticeable how they tried to change my mind. And I had a couple of 3 meetings with, would have been the divisional officer. And he said, then why don't you learn Russian? Go on this course. And even the books arrived, and I started learning. But I thought, no, this is me, I'm leaving the Navy. And looking back, I wonder if they wanted me to learn Russian to try and keep me in. So why you know Russian now? We can give you this job. You can go and do this. Or whether it happened to quite a few of us to learn Russian, because obviously it was the Cold War.
Yeah, I don't think it happened to everybody. I think that they picked people who they thought would have the academic bent for being able to pick up the language, because not everybody is wired that way. But you were always a little bit flowery with your language, weren't you? So maybe they thought that you could probably be a bit flowery with your Russian as well as your English. So that's probably why. Yeah, obviously Cherry B, I left and went to Northwood and spent time up in Northwood, HMS Warrior, before going on to the Manchester in 86. So it was late 84 that you joined the Charybdis.
I think it was late 84, because I left the Charybdis in April, and then I was at Drake Barrack Guard for about 6 months.
Quality job.
That's not something I'm going to be talking about.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, Barrack Guard anywhere is just not worth talking about, is it? But soul destroying jobs.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so no, Cherry Beach is a lovely ship, great crew, really good people, very fond memories of some of the guys that I worked with. Very fortunate to still be in touch with some of them. Overall, a good time.
And for every ex-messmate that we served with who listens to this, cheers.
Yeah, cheers. And, even if you're a total pain in the backside, not literally, but metaphorically, it's a long time ago and I get it all now. So don't worry about it. No, it's great. It's good people.
All right, mate.
Take care, fella.
Speak to you again soon.
Later. Bye-bye.